My name is Henry Lawson, and if someone had walked up to me just 1 year ago, maybe at the grocery store, maybe while I was pumping gas, maybe while I was sitting alone in that rickety old recliner of mine, and told me that I'd soon be standing on the polished deck of a five-star cruise ship, the kind of floating palace people save their whole lives to afford, with warm ocean wind brushing against my face, while the sun rose over waters so blue they looked painted. All while my family back home scrambled like the world was ending, I would have laughed. Not a polite chuckle either. I'm talking about a full-belly laugh, the kind that makes your ribs hurt because the idea of me, a worn-down 58-year-old man with aching joints and a pantry more empty than full, going on a luxury cruise. That would have sounded ridiculous, impossible, like someone was mixing me up with a man who lived a completely different life. You see, up until the exact moment everything blew apart like a cheap firework, I honestly believed, deep in my bones, that I was a good father. Not perfect. No honest man over 50 pretends to be flawless. I had my temper back in the younger days. I worked too much, missed a few birthdays, skipped a few school events when bills were tighter than a jar lid, but I always tried. And that's the part people forget, that trying counts. I worked 2 jobs for decades, hands cracked open every winter, back stiff as a tow hitch every morning. All of it so my only son, David, never had to grow up the way I did, where dinner was sometimes 2 slices of bread and a prayer, and where the power bill was a monthly gamble. I thought he appreciated that. I really did. I thought we were close, not best buddy close, but father and son close. The kind of close where a man can sit across from his boy at the dinner table and see a reflection of every sacrifice he made. I thought he respected me. I thought he cared. I thought the years spent showing up, fixing broken things, paying for emergencies, and silently carrying responsibilities had built something strong between us. But life can be cruel in its timing. It waits until you're tired, until your knees scream, until your heart is cracked from losses you still don't talk about. And then it drops a truth in your lap so heavy it knocks the breath right out of you. The night everything shifted, the night the floor started sliding out from under my feet, was nothing special, nothing dramatic. I was sitting in the living room of the home I worked 32 long, back-breaking years to pay off. A home that still smells like my late wife, Margaret, when the sun hits the curtains just right. My joints were aching, not the regular "I'm tired because I'm old" kind of ache. This one sat deep, like frozen steel wedged into my knees. Earlier that day, David had asked me to come help repair his fence. I shouldn't have done it, not with my age and my joints acting up, but he asked with that tone, half annoyed, half expecting, that kids use when they assume their parents will always say yes. So, like a loyal old dog who doesn't know when to rest, I grabbed my tools, drove over, and did the work he should have paid a contractor for. I pushed myself far past what my body could handle, but that's what dads do. We show up, even when our backs scream, even when our hands shake, even when some quiet voice in the back of our minds whispers, "Mate, you're way past your limit," using that Aussie slang I picked up from an old coworker years ago and never forgot. We ignore the warnings because our kids need us, or at least, we believe they do. But the moment that changed my life didn't come from pain or exhaustion or even a loud argument. It came in the calmest way possible. Casual, careless, like it was nothing, like I was nothing. I was sitting at the dining table after helping him all day, sipping on a glass of water because my body felt like it had been wrung out. David walked into the kitchen. His wife Jess followed him. They talked in low voices about some plans for the weekend. I wasn't paying too much attention until David sighed, rolled his eyes, and said the sentence that sliced through me cleaner than any knife ever could. "Honestly, Jess, Dad's becoming a burden. A burden. A burden." He didn't whisper it. He didn't hesitate. He didn't check if I could hear him. He said it like he was stating a fact, like he was announcing what the weather would be tomorrow. Like the word burden had been sitting on the tip of his tongue for a long time, waiting for the right moment to fall out. The world didn't stop. No dramatic thunder. No dramatic music. Just that one word hanging in the air, heavier than anything I had ever carried. It hit me harder than any punch I ever took in high school scuffles, harder than losing my first job at 22, harder than the day I buried Margaret. This hit me in the place of my soul where I kept every memory of raising him, every Christmas morning, every scraped knee, every school project, every moment I stayed up late to finish a night shift and still woke up early to pack his lunch. And yet I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I didn't defend myself. I just sat there completely still, invisible, like the chair beneath me had swallowed me into the wood. Jess's eyes flicked toward me, and for a second I think she realized I'd heard. But she didn't say anything. She didn't correct him. She didn't even nudge him. She just looked down, and that silence of hers made the whole thing even worse, as if she agreed. In that exact moment, that tiny quiet moment, I understood something I never thought I'd have to understand. My own son didn't see me as a father anymore. He saw me as dead weight, as an inconvenience, as someone that required effort he didn't want to give. And if that's how he saw me, maybe it was time for me to stop being his convenience. Maybe it was time to stop bending until my spine snapped. Maybe it was time to live for myself, for the first damn time in 58 long years. So the next morning I didn't wake up angry. I didn't slam doors or throw accusations. I didn't make dramatic speeches. I didn't even wait for anyone to wake up. I moved quietly, the way a man moves when he's made a decision so solid nothing can shake it loose. I packed my bags, folded clothes neatly, not because I'm tidy but because it felt respectful to myself. I grabbed my old passport, the one I never used because life kept happening. I booked a 5-star cruise, something so wildly out of character that I felt like I was watching someone else do it. And then I walked out of my house, got into my truck and left. Not to scare him, not to punish him, not even to get revenge. I left because something painful but freeing had settled inside me, a new truth that both hurt and healed. If your own child believes you're a burden, then you owe them absolutely nothing. And when that massive ship pulled away from the dock later that afternoon, the coastline drifting farther and farther until it blurred into the horizon, I felt something settle over me, something I hadn't felt in decades, not since Margaret was alive. Peace. Pure, quiet, soft peace. But don't get it twisted, this isn't a story about running away. This is a story about what happens when a man who has spent his whole life giving finally chooses himself. And more importantly, what happens when the people who took him for granted realize far too late what they've lost. Because only a few days into that cruise, everything changed. My phone started lighting up like a Christmas tree. First a few calls, then a dozen, then dozens, then messages, hundreds of them, blowing up the screen like a 4-alarm emergency. My son, his wife, my sister, even my neighbors. Everyone suddenly desperate, panicked, begging for me to answer, begging for me to come home. But I didn't. Not yet. Because deep down, I knew something they didn't want to admit. The truth had only just begun to reveal itself. And the real betrayal, the betrayal I never imagined possible, was waiting just around the corner, ready to hit me harder than that word burden ever did. Most people think the moment that breaks you is loud, someone shouting, a slammed door, a fight that rattles the walls. But the truth is, the most painful moments are whisper soft. They don't roar, they don't explode, they just land. And when they land, they settle inside you like wet concrete, heavy and cold and impossible to scrape out. That's how I felt driving home that night. My hands were gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles had turned pale, almost ghost white in the glow of the dashboard. I wasn't thinking about the road, or the cars, or the streetlights blurring by. I just kept hearing that one word repeat in my head like a broken record skipping on the same ugly line. Burden. It didn't matter how I tried to twist it, justify it, soften it, it still cut the same. I've been called a lot of things in my life. Poor, stubborn, old-fashioned, too serious, too soft, not soft enough. But never, not once, did I imagine my own child, the kid I raised, the boy whose scraped knees I patched, whose nightmares I chased away, whose college tuition I bled myself dry to pay, would ever look at me and see inconvenience. When I pulled into my driveway, the house looked smaller than usual. Not physically, the structure hadn't changed, but something in me had. And when that happens, when the world inside your chest shifts, everything around you feels different. Older, colder, emptier. The door creaked when I opened it. It's been doing that for years, and Margaret always said, "Henry, for God's sake, fix that hinge." I never did. And now, standing there in the doorway with my bones aching and my throat tight, I felt that creak like a welcome from a home that remembered me better than my own family did. Inside, the air felt stale, like the place had been holding its breath in my absence. I dropped my keys on the kitchen counter. The sound echoed far too loud for such a small action, and I stood there for a long moment, staring at the fridge covered in old magnets from places I'd never visited. Boston, Nashville, Grand Canyon, Yosemite, all places Margaret dreamed we'd see once we retired. Places we talked about during late nights when we were young, sitting on the porch swing, planning a future that felt so far away. A future we kept postponing because there was always something more important. David's school, David's braces, David's first car, David's college payments, David's wedding. And now David's disappointment. I walked to the living room and sank into my recliner, the same spot I sat in every night since she passed, and the quiet hit me like a punch. Not just silence. Silence with weight, the kind that pulls at your ribs from the inside. My joints pulsed with a slow, familiar ache. Getting older is funny. You wake up one day and realize your body has been having conversations with you for years, and you've ignored every single one. I rubbed my knee absent-mindedly and exhaled long enough for my breath to tremble at the end. And then I heard it again in my mind. Dad becoming a burden. I closed my eyes, hoping the darkness behind my eyelids would drown it out. It didn't. If anything, it made the memories sharper, clearer, crueler. His voice wasn't angry. That's what made it hurt. Anger I can handle. I've handled anger my whole life, from bosses, strangers, even my own wife once or twice. But apathy, carelessness, the casual tone of someone who says something they've already accepted as truth. That was a different kind of knife. In that moment, sitting there alone in a house that once overflowed with warmth and noise and the smell of Margaret's apple pie, I felt something inside me quietly shift. Not break, shifts are worse. Breaks can be repaired. Shifts change the whole foundation. I wasn't just hurt, I wasn't just tired, I was done. But not in the way people think. I wasn't done living. I was done waiting. Done trying to fit into a life where I no longer belonged. Done hoping my son would someday see me the way I saw him, as someone worth loving, respecting, keeping close. I reached for the old wooden shelf beside my recliner, pulled down a dusty leather-bound book and wiped off the cover with the sleeve of my shirt. Our travel journal, mine and Margaret's, 28 pages filled with plans we never got to live out. Notes written in her handwriting, loopy, warm, hopeful, describing sunsets she dreamed of seeing. Mountains she wanted to climb, beaches she wanted to walk barefoot on, holding my hand. I flipped through the pages slowly, my fingers tracing her words as if touching them would bring her back for even a moment. Every line screamed the same painful truth. We kept putting life on hold. And for what? To be useful. To be reliable. To be needed. Needed. Funny how that word felt so different now. I used to crave being needed. I used to think it gave my life meaning. But when need turns into expectation, when your presence becomes a job instead of a blessing, the weight changes. And eventually, you collapse under it. I don't know how long I sat there staring at that journal. Minutes, hours. Time didn't move the same way that night. But eventually my hands moved on their own. Opening my laptop, pulling up the website I had bookmarked years ago but never dared to revisit. A cruise, a stupid luxury I once thought belonged to other people. The rich, the carefree, the ones who didn't have to choose between bills and groceries. But as I stared at those pictures, the bright deck lights, the sparkling water, the cabins that looked like hotel rooms floating on the sea, something strange happened. I didn't feel guilty. For the first time in decades, I didn't feel guilty for wanting something. I entered my information with trembling fingers. When the confirmation page loaded, I sat back and let the reality sink in. I was leaving. Not forever, but long enough to remember who I was before life convinced me I didn't matter outside of what I could do for others. And as the house settled around me, the creaking walls, the quiet rooms, the ghost of Margaret humming in the kitchen, I whispered something to myself, something no one had ever said to me out loud. You don't have to stay somewhere you feel unwanted. I didn't sleep that night. I wasn't sad. I wasn't angry. I was free, quietly, cautiously free. And that freedom, small as it was, lit a fire in me I didn't know I still had. The fire to leave. The fire to live. The fire to stop being the burden someone else convinced me I was. And that fire, that tiny spark, would become an inferno none of them saw coming. I woke up before the alarm even buzzed, long before the neighborhood birds started their usual morning arguments, long before the sun rose high enough to warm the old shingles on my roof. The room was dim, just a faint strip of golden light sneaking through the blinds, like the day itself was tapping me on the shoulder saying, "Henry, it's time." And for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, I didn't groan or roll over or wonder how I would muster the energy to stand. No. I swung my legs off the bed with a steadiness that surprised even me. My knees still cracked, my back still protested, but there was something under all that stiffness, something alive, something electric, a spark I hadn't felt since I was a young man. I shuffled into the kitchen and brewed coffee the way I liked it, strong enough to wake the dead, bitter enough to make your eyes water. Margaret always teased me for it. She said it tasted like melted asphalt. She'd make her own cup immediately after, adding sugar like she was sweetening an entire winter. I used to roll my eyes at that memory, used to feel a sting in my chest every time it crossed my mind. But that morning, for once, remembering her didn't hurt. It felt warm. Like she was standing behind me, arms folded, watching me pack like she used to before our rare weekend trips. My travel bag sat on the kitchen table, already zipped and ready. I'd packed it at 3 in the morning, unable to sleep. Shorts I hadn't worn since before my hair turned gray, shirts that still smelled faintly of the cedar closet, a pair of swim trunks I bought years ago but never had the courage or the occasion to wear, and a book, a thick, ambitious novel I'd been trying to finish for almost a decade. I slipped it in the side pocket like a small promise to myself. But what took me the longest wasn't packing, it was writing the note. The pen hovered over the paper for several long minutes. My mind kept swinging between anger and sadness, between wanting to explain everything and wanting to explain nothing at all. In the end, I wrote the simplest words I could manage. Taking some time for myself. I'll be unreachable for a while, don't worry. That last part, "don't worry," tasted strange coming from me. I'd spent my whole life being the one who did the worrying, but I wasn't writing for comfort. I wasn't writing to soften the blow. I wrote it because it was the truth. I didn't want them to worry. I just wanted to breathe. I placed the note not on the kitchen island where it'd be obvious, not next to the fridge where bills and reminders usually got pinned, but right on the tool drawer handle. The one David always yanked open whenever he came over pretending to visit but really just needing a wrench, a screwdriver, or something he'd lost again. I didn't want my departure to feel like some dramatic disappearing act. I wanted it to be found. Eventually. whenever they actually noticed I wasn't there. When I stepped outside, locking the front door behind me, I paused for a breath. That house, that old stubborn house with its peeling paint and creaky stairs, had seen every version of me. The newly married version. The young father who paced all night with a colicky baby. The middle-aged man juggling 2 jobs just to pay bills on time. The widower who had to learn how to sleep on the left side of the bed because the right side was too painful to look at. And now, whatever version of me this was. I walked to my truck without looking back. It was strange, I always looked back. Even when leaving for work, even when running to the store. I'd glance at the house like it was a child I needed to keep an eye on. But not this time. This time, I wasn't leaving something behind. I was stepping towards something ahead. The airport felt like a different planet. People rushing, shouting, hugging, yawning, life stirring in every corner. A father juggling 2 toddlers. A college girl crying into her phone. A couple arguing over a boarding pass. Life everywhere, buzzing, chaotic, loud. And me, quiet, steady, moving through it all like a ghost slipping through crowds. But when the shuttle reached the port, everything changed. The cruise ship rose in front of me like a floating skyscraper, gleaming white and impossibly massive. I stood there staring up at it, mouth slightly open, feeling like a kid again seeing the ocean for the first time. The sunlight bounced off the metal rails and glass windows, turning the whole thing into a shimmering giant. People were lined up at the boarding gate, young, old, families, groups of friends, all of them buzzing with that same pre-vacation thrill I hadn't felt since before life hardened me. When I stepped onto the gangway and scanned my ticket, the ship vibrated faintly under my feet. The air smelled like salt, warm breeze and sunscreen. A cheerful worker took my suitcase with a grin that felt too bright for my tired eyes, and suddenly I was there on board. On this massive vessel that didn't care how old I was, or how many years I spent working, or how recently I'd been called a burden. I walked to the deck and leaned against the railing, letting the ocean wind slap gently against my face. God, it felt good. It felt like someone had poured cool water down my soul after years of burning quietly. When the horn sounded deep, thunderous, echoing across the port, something inside me loosened, actually loosened. My chest felt lighter, my shoulders dropped, my mind unclenched. As the ship pulled away, the shoreline shrank, houses turned into dots, cars into specks. I thought I'd feel guilt, or loneliness, or fear, but I felt reborn, like this wasn't running away, like this was the first real step I had taken for myself in decades. For a few beautiful hours, everything was perfect. I wandered the decks. I watched kids splash in the pool. I sipped iced tea on a lounge chair like some retired Florida man who had it all figured out. No one knew me. No one expected anything from me. I was dad who can help move furniture. I was grandpa who should babysit. I was Henry who must stay strong for everyone. I was just Henry, a man on a ship. Then my phone buzzed. Once, twice, a third time. Then nonstop. The screen lit up so bright it pulled me harshly away from the moment. I frowned and picked it up. 30 missed calls. David. Jessica. My sister. My neighbor. Voicemails. Texts. Notifications stacking so fast the screen froze. What's going on? Where are you? This isn't funny. Call us back now. Please, it's urgent. Dad, answer your phone, this is serious. At first my heart jumped, instinct habit, that old father reflex that says your family needs you. But something about the volume of messages, the urgency, the panic. It wasn't concern. No. It felt different. Wrong. This wasn't the tone of people worried they'd hurt me. This was the tone of people terrified of something being revealed. Guilt, fear, or something uglier. I set the phone face down on the table. I didn't answer. Not yet. Not until I knew what I was walking into. Because deep down, in the quiet place where your instincts whisper truths you don't want to hear, I felt it. Something was happening back home. Something they didn't want me to find out. Something that smelled greatly of betrayal. By the third day of the cruise, the ocean had begun to feel like its own world, a place that didn't follow the same rules as the land I'd left behind. The ship hummed gently beneath my feet as if it were breathing with me, giving me a rhythm to follow, a slow exhale I didn't know I needed. I spent most mornings on the top deck, leaning back in a chair that squeaked every time I shifted, watching the horizon stretch endlessly in every direction. It was calming, but it also stirred something in me, a mix of freedom and fear, like standing on the edge of a cliff and realizing the ground behind you is gone. I must have looked lost in that moment, because that was when I heard a voice, sharp, amused, and full of a confidence I hadn't felt in years. "You look like a bloke who's thinking too much." I turned my head and there she was, a woman with silver hair cut short, bright eyes that saw more than they let on, and a sun hat that looked way too big for her small frame. She was holding a cup of tea, steam drifting lazily into the air. She sat down beside me like she'd been planning to do it all morning. Her accent alone could slice through any fog of thought. I raised an eyebrow and smiled. "Is it that obvious?" She smirked. "Mate, you're staring at the water like it owes you money." I laughed, not a small polite laugh, not the kind you give when a cashier makes a joke about your receipt, but the kind that comes from somewhere low in your chest. A real laugh. It had been far too long since something cracked through the weight sitting on my shoulders like that. Her name was Amelia, and she was a retired nurse from Brisbane. She told me that in the same breezy tone someone might use when introducing themselves at a backyard barbecue. She spoke with a certain openness, the kind that made you feel like you known her far longer than a few minutes. And the thing about her wasn't that she was loud or nosy. No, she had this presence, this quiet confidence, the kind that let you know she'd lived through enough storms to understand what it meant to survive them. We started talking, the way people do when they meet on vacation, but somehow the conversation didn't stay shallow for long. Maybe it was the ocean, maybe it was the way the ship seemed to cradle everyone on board, maybe it was just her, but within minutes, we were talking like old friends. We talked about life after retirement, which she described as bloody confusing, honestly, and I agreed. We talked about losing people we loved. She told me about her husband, a man she adored for nearly 4 decades, who passed away suddenly one Sunday morning while reading the paper. The way she spoke about him, soft, steady, no bitterness, just love preserved in memory, it reminded me of Margaret. My throat tightened when she mentioned him, and she must have noticed because she didn't push, didn't pry. She just sipped her tea and waited. And I found myself telling her things I hadn't said out loud in years. Not the small talk kind of things, no. I told her about the loneliness that crept around my house like a draft after Margaret was gone. I told her about how aging felt like becoming invisible in slow motion. And then, finally, I told her about David, about the fence, the living room, the way he looked right past me when he said the words that still echoed like something sharp scraping against metal. Dad becoming a burden. I expected her to react, to gasp, to look shocked, to say how terrible that was, but she didn't. She just watched me for a long second, her eyes soft but clear, and then she nodded slowly. "Kids can be cruel when they forget their parents are humans first," she said. That sentence, God, that sentence hit harder than I wanted it to. Because she wasn't sugarcoating it, wasn't trying to paint David as stressed or tired or overwhelmed. No excuses, no soft landing, just the truth, clean, painful, and real. And hearing someone say it, hearing someone acknowledge that the pain wasn't imaginary, that I wasn't overreacting, it loosened something inside me. A knot that had been sitting in my chest since that night slowly began to unravel. We talked for nearly an hour, and the thing about Amelia wasn't that she tried to fix anything. She didn't offer advice unless I asked. She didn't try to make me feel better. She just listened. She let my words hang in the air and didn't rush to fill the silence. And after years of feeling like a background character in my own life, having someone simply listen felt like a luxury I didn't know I'd missed so much. But the peace didn't last long. My phone wouldn't stop buzzing, calls, texts, alerts stacking up like someone was pounding on my door from miles away. I tried to ignore it at first, turning the phone face down on the table. But the buzzing kept coming, again and again, vibrating so hard it nearly danced off the table. Amelia noticed the tension in my shoulders. She leaned back in her chair, raised her eyebrows, and said in that blunt Aussie way, "Looks like someone buggered up and wants to fix it." That made me laugh again, but only for a second, because I knew deep down the messages weren't just apologies or concerns. There was something else under all that panic, a tone of desperation that didn't match the simple explanation of worry. She placed a gentle hand on my forearm, grounding me. "Face it when you're ready," she said, "not a second before." Her voice was calm, almost serene, like she knew this wasn't something I could outrun forever. And for a moment, sitting there under the warm sun with the ocean rolling like blue velvet below us, I believed I could take my time. I believed I could breathe. That when I eventually picked up that phone, I'd be ready for whatever waited on the other end. But I was. Because later that evening, after staring at my phone screen long enough to see my reflection trembling in the glass, I finally answered one of the calls. And in that moment, in that single devastating moment, everything I thought I knew about my son shattered into pieces I couldn't have imagined. When I finally dialed my sister's number, I expected irritation, maybe a lecture about not answering my phone. But the way she picked up, so fast the call barely had time to ring, told me something was very wrong. Her voice came through the speaker like a cracked whip, sharp with fear. "Henry, Jesus, where are you? We've been losing our minds." For a second I thought she was overreacting. I thought maybe David told her some exaggerated story about me storming out. So I responded casually, too casually. "I'm on a cruise," I said, looking out over the ocean, trying to keep my voice steady. "A cruise," she repeated, her shock exploding through the phone so loud I had to pull it away from my ear. "What the hell are you doing on a cruise?" Her tone made me straighten in my seat. Not confusion, not annoyance, something deeper, fear, panic. Something that didn't match the situation at all. And before I could ask her anything else, she hit me with a sentence that didn't just make me pause, it froze me completely. "Did David tell you what he did? What happened after you left his house?" Those words, they were wrong, too heavy, too dark. And the pitch of her voice told me she wasn't asking for drama, she was preparing me for impact. A cold wave ran through me, not the refreshing kind you feel on a beach, but the kind that crawls into your bones. "What did he do?" I asked, though part of me didn't want the answer. Part of me hoped she'd say he cried, or he apologized, or he realized he was wrong. Anything simple, anything human. But instead she sucked in a breath so deep it shook through the phone. "Henry, he tried to access your bank account." My stomach dropped so fast it felt like the deck tilted beneath me. "What?" I whispered, as if she might say she misspoke. "Your retirement account," she said. "The one Margaret left for you. He tried to move funds, said it was a family need. The bank flagged it because the request didn't match your usual behavior, and when they couldn't reach you, they called me." For several seconds I didn't breathe. I just sat there staring at the endless ocean like it might give me answers, like the waves knew something I didn't. My own son, my blood, my boy I raised with shaking hands and sleepless nights. My son who I held when he had fevers. My son who cried into my chest when he failed a test at 14. My son who I told every single birthday that no matter what he did in life, I would always be proud of him. He tried to take the money his mother left me. The last gift she gave me before cancer stole her away. My hands trembled violently. I had to grip the armrest just to steady myself. The cruise breeze suddenly felt like ice. Why would he do that? I managed, though my throat felt too tight to speak. My sister didn't answer at first. I could hear her swallowing. I could hear her packing on the other end because the sound of her footsteps tapped against the phone speaker. She was nervous, hesitant. There was something she hadn't said yet, something worse. And then she delivered the blow that cracked me open in a way no argument, no disappointment, no harsh comment from my son ever had. "Because he thought you were done with life," she said softly. "He told the bank you couldn't manage your money anymore, that you were declining, that he needed to take over." Declining. It echoed through my head like thunder, rolling across a black sky. Declining meaning incompetent, meaning useless, meaning the father who raised him was no longer a person but a responsibility, a burden, something to be controlled and moved aside. Not one mistake. Not one argument. Not one heated moment. No, this was deliberate, calculated, cold. And it wasn't just about money. No, this was about power, ownership. He wanted authority over me, over my life, over everything I had left. I ended the call without remembering what I said. I don't even know if I said goodbye. My entire world shrank to the size of the phone in my hand, buzzing again and again from missed calls I refused to answer. The deck around me felt distant. The laughter of tourists blurred into meaningless noise. The sun dimmed. The air thickened. Everything narrowed into one tight, sharp feeling that settled deep inside me. It wasn't sadness, though there was sadness buried somewhere under the rubble. It wasn't anger, though anger simmered hot enough to burn through steel. No, what I felt was something else, something older, something colder, something precise. A clarity I hadn't felt in years. Revenge wasn't something I sought. It wasn't a fantasy. It wasn't bitterness. It was instinct. It was survival. It was the rightful answer to betrayal. And in that moment, staring at the horizon where the sky met the sea, I understood something with painful clarity. My son didn't just push me away from his dinner table. He tried to erase me. And men like me, men who built their lives brick by brick, do not disappear quietly. Something inside me hardened. Something inside me awakened. And for the first time in a very long time, I wasn't scared of anything anymore. I didn't want loud revenge. Not the kind people brag about or whisper behind closed doors. Not fire or fury or lawsuits or public humiliation. No, what I wanted was quieter, sharper, more enduring. I wanted truth, the kind that doesn't need to shout because it stands tall on its own. The kind that slips under the skin and settles deep. I wanted my son to finally see what life looked like without me cushioning every fall he created for himself. Without me smoothing over every mistake. Without me being the invisible scaffolding that held up everything he built. Without him ever acknowledging the hands that hammered it together. I wanted him to see the world without the safety net he took for granted. The world I protected him from for decades. After the shock settled, after the betrayal stopped rattling like broken glass inside my chest, something inside me clicked. A realization. A quiet decision. If my son wanted to treat me like a man who was fatting, like a burden slowly slipping out of relevance, then fine. I would disappear, but on my terms. Not as the weak old man he decided I was, but as someone who finally stepped back to let him face the consequences of his own choices. The next morning, I made an appointment with the cruise ship's business advisor. They don't advertise it loudly, but cruises, especially long ones, often have consultants for retirees, travelers settling their affairs, people trying to reorganize the last chapters of their lives. When I walked into his small office overlooking the water, I expected confusion or pity. Instead, he greeted me with a kind of tired, understanding you only see in people who have heard the same heartbreak told through 100 different voices. When I told him what my son had done, he didn't gasp, didn't lean forward dramatically, didn't offer empty sympathy. He just sighed, rubbed the bridge of his nose and muttered, "Parents build. Kids take apart." His voice was soft, almost resigned, like he'd seen too many fathers and mothers walk in with that same look in their eyes, the look that said love had been stretched until it snapped. We talked for a long time, longer than I expected. I told him everything, not just the financial part, but the years of being the reliable one, the steady one, the one who held everyone together even when no one bothered to glance back to see if I was holding on myself. He listened the way Amelia did, quietly, without judgment. And when I finished, he nodded and said, "Let's protect what's yours." From that moment, I moved with a clarity I hadn't felt since I was a younger man, the kind of clarity that comes not from anger, but from understanding exactly what has to be done. I reorganized every part of my life that my son had once assumed would fall neatly into his hands. I moved my savings into a private international bank that dealt exclusively with senior clients who wanted sovereignty. I updated every document, every beneficiary entry, every emergency contact. I even rewrote my will, not out of spite, but out of a fierce, renewed sense of ownership over the life I still had left to live. For the first time in years, I didn't write things with him in mind. I didn't worry about how he would react. I didn't think about his needs, his pressure, his future. I thought about mine. I protected what Margaret and I built, what we worked for, what she whispered she wanted from me on nights when she was too sick to speak above a whisper. Her voice echoed in my memory as I signed document after document. Live the rest of your life how you want, Henry, not how anyone expects you to. I even spoke with a legal specialist the cruise company connected me to, just to ensure there was a record of what he attempted. Not to punish him, not to drag him through court, but to create something more important: documentation. A line in a file that said this happened. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a choice he made. A quiet, undeniable truth. When everything was finalized, when every signature had dried, when every account was protected, when every connection my son once had access to was severed, I took one last breath and did something I never imagined I'd do. I blocked him. His number, his messages, his emails, his desperate attempts at control disguised as concern. I didn't shut him out forever. No, but I needed space. I needed distance. I needed time to build the life he never let me have because I was always too busy building his. When I finally stepped out onto the deck again, the sun was slipping behind the horizon in a blaze of gold, turning the waves into molten glass. People laughed around me, drinks in hand, strolling along the rails without a care in the world. And for the first time in decades, I felt something I didn't recognize at first because it had been so long. Power? Not the loud kind, not dominance, not ego, but the kind that comes from reclaiming yourself. The kind that settles deep in your bones and whispers, "You're not done, not yet, not by a long shot." And as the sky shifted from gold to a deep, dignified blue, I realized something. My life wasn't ending. It was beginning again, without apology, without permission, and without the weight of someone who saw me only as what I could give, not who I was. For the first time, I wasn't living for anyone else. I was living for me. The next week on the cruise changed me in ways I didn't even realize at first. It didn't happen with fireworks or revelations or some dramatic movie moment. It happened slowly, quietly, naturally, like an old wound finally deciding to stop hurting. Every morning I woke up, and for the first time in my entire adult life, there was nothing waiting for me. No list of responsibilities, no errands, no phone calls. No one expecting me to fix their problems, lift their burdens, or sacrifice parts of myself for their comfort. I opened my eyes and felt light, almost weightless, like I had been carrying 50 invisible pounds for so long that I forgot how it felt to stand without them. I would step out onto the balcony attached to my little cabin and let the morning breeze wash over me, warm, salty, gentle. The kind of air that doesn't just touch your skin, but sinks into your lungs and reminds you that breathing is supposed to feel good, not like a chore. I drank coffee slowly, savoring each sip instead of gulping it between obligations. I watched the horizon stretch out endlessly. No deadlines, no clocks dictating when I should stop enjoying myself and start being useful again. And for a man who spent decades being the glue of a family that never once bothered to ask if he needed holding together too, this freedom felt revolutionary. I swam every day, the kind of swimming I hadn't done since Margaret was alive, unhurried, playful, letting the water hold me up the way life never did. I ate food that made me feel human again, not just fed. I tried things I never had time for. I laughed with strangers who didn't look at me like I was old or slow or inconvenient. And somewhere in that blur of sunsets and soft ocean winds, I made friends. Real ones. People who talked about stories, adventures, heartbreak, fears, joys. Not bills, not responsibilities, not what they expected from me. And then there was Amelia. Amelia became my anchor, my mirror, my reminder that growing older didn't mean growing invisible. She walked onto that deck one afternoon with her silver hair tied back, her sunglasses crooked, her laugh loud enough to wake the seagulls, and somehow she sat beside me like she'd known me for years. We spoke like two souls who had been waiting for the right moment to collide. We talked about everything most adults avoid, regrets we carried quietly, dreams we thought we lost, mistakes that shaped us, loneliness we never admitted to. She told me stories from her years as a nurse, the night she held strangers' hands as they took their last breaths because their own families couldn't be bothered to show up. She said that was why she traveled now. I spent too long caring for people who were already gone. Now I care for the moments that still have life in them. When she said that, I felt something shift in me, a reminder that my own moments weren't gone. I wasn't done yet. One night we sat under a sky so full of stars it looked painted. The ship hummed underneath us, steady and calm, like it was carrying not just our bodies but our burdens too. I told her everything, the betrayal, the words that stung, the years I'd spent giving and giving until my hands were empty. I admitted how small I felt the night David called me a burden, how it cracked something inside me I didn't even know was fragile. She didn't interrupt, she didn't give advice. She just watched me with those soft, knowing eyes. Then she said something I'll never forget for as long as I live. Sometimes distance is the only way to teach people what closeness really meant. At first I didn't understand. But the longer I stayed away, the more those words settled. The distance wasn't punishment. It wasn't abandonment. It was clarity, space for me to breathe, space for him to notice the air he'd been taking for granted. And in that space, I rediscovered parts of myself I thought had died with Margaret. I started writing again, actual writing, not grocery lists or banknotes or reminders. I wrote memories, thoughts, characters, pieces of myself I had hidden away because life had demanded too much space. I pulled out an old sketchbook and with shaky hands began drawing. My lines weren't perfect, and sometimes my fingers ached, but every stroke reminded me that my hands still had purpose. Not for fixing someone else's broken door or repairing someone else's mistakes, but for creating something just for me. I walked the decks alone sometimes, not because I was lonely, but because solitude no longer felt like punishment. It felt like peace. I stood on the railing watching the water ripple in the moonlight, and I realized I was living, really living, without having to ask permission for it. For the first time in years, I wasn't afraid. I wasn't waiting. I wasn't shrinking myself so others could feel comfortable. I existed fully, freely. And not once did I feel like a burden. Not once did I feel like someone's extra weight. For the first time in a long time, the world had finally stopped spinning fast enough for me to catch up and breathe. Little did I know, the peace I found out on that open water, that fragile, beautiful peace, was about to be tested by something I never saw coming. 2 weeks into the cruise, when the sun had already kissed my skin into a warm bronze and my heart had settled into a rhythm I didn't know peace could create, I decided it was time. Not to forgive, not to forget, just time to hear whatever storm had been brewing back home. I sat on my balcony, the ocean stretching out in an endless blue sheet before me, and I unblocked my son's number. It wasn't even 5 seconds, not 5 full seconds, before my phone lit up like it was possessed. His name flashed across the screen, vibrating so hard it rattled against the table. I took a slow breath, not anxious, not nervous, just ready in the way a man becomes ready when he's found himself again. I answered, "Dad, Dad, Dad, is that you? Oh, thank God, Dad, please, please talk to me. Where are you? Are you safe? I've been calling every day, every hour, Dad, please." His voice didn't just crack, it shattered. It sounded like someone had taken all his pride, wrung it out, and left him with nothing but raw fear. I didn't rush to calm him. I didn't speak softly like I used to. I didn't cushion anything. That man, the one who swallowed his pain to protect his son, stayed behind on the dock when this ship sailed away. So my voice came out steady, controlled. "David," I said, "why did you try to access my account?" The silence that followed was thick. The kind of silence where you can hear the person on the other end thinking, panicking, scrambling for the right lie but realizing none of them fit anymore. I could hear his breath hitch, a sharp inhale like he'd just taken a punch. Finally, in this defeated whisper, he said, I thought you didn't want to live alone anymore." I closed my eyes, not because it hurt, but because it confirmed what I already knew. He didn't see me as a person. He saw me as a responsibility he wanted to manage, a loose end he wanted to tie up neatly. "And is that why you called me a burden?" I asked. He didn't speak, just breathed in these short, broken little gasps, then a sniff, then another, and then, "I didn't mean it like that," he croaked. "Yes," I said gently but firmly, "you did. And I swear on everything I love," my son sobbed. Not the dramatic kind people put on for show, not the frustrated anger cry of someone caught doing something wrong. No, this was a helpless, cracking, childlike sound that only comes from a heart finally breaking under its own guilt. I heard it all, the tremble in his throat, the quiver of every breath, the way he kept trying to speak and failing. I could almost picture him sitting on his couch, head in his hands, the weight of reality dropping on him like cold stone. "Dad," he choked out, "please come home, please. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have said that, just shouldn't have agreed. I shouldn't have tried to touch your account. I panicked, I messed up, I made a mistake. Please, please come home, I need you." And that was the moment everything became painfully clear. He didn't miss me. He missed the version of me that made his life easier. The version of me who always picked up the slack. The version of me who'd show up at his house with tools, groceries, advice, babysitting help, money, anything. The version who existed to fill the gaps, so he never had to feel discomfort. He didn't miss Henry the man. He missed Dad the safety net. I let the silence stretch, because sometimes silence is the only teacher strong enough to reach a grown man's heart. "David," I said finally, "when was the last time you called me just to ask how I'm doing?" He didn't answer. "When was the last time you came by my house without needing something, without asking for my time, my labor, my savings?" Still nothing. "When was the last time you looked at me as a man who hurts, a man who gets tired, a man who bleeds on the inside even when he smiles on the outside?" Nothing but quiet sobbing on the other end. And for the first time since this whole mess began, I didn't feel guilty. I didn't feel torn. I didn't feel like I was abandoning him. I felt awake. "You don't need me," I said. "You need what I used to give you. That's not the same." He sobbed harder, the kind of crying that comes from truth finally ripping through denial. "Dad, please," he whispered, "please don't leave me." But the thing was, I hadn't left him. He had pushed me out long before I ever stepped onto that ship. The moment he called me a burden, he made it clear I was optional, disposable, something he tolerated, not cherished. He broke the bond. I just finally stopped trying to tape it back together alone. And as the waves swayed the ship beneath me, as the warm wind brushed across my face, as I listened to my grown son unravel on the phone, I felt something I never expected. Strength, maybe even a little peace. Because for once, he was learning a lesson I should have taught him years ago. If you treat someone like a burden long enough, they eventually learn how to live without you. When the cruise finally docked and the world I had temporarily set aside came back into view, I stepped off that ship as someone I barely recognized, in the best possible way. The old version of me, the man who left home exhausted, hollow, and quietly begging for scraps of affection, felt like a distant memory, someone I used to know but no longer wished to be. My shoulders felt lighter, my mind clearer, and my heart, for the first time in years, beat with steadiness instead of fear. I didn't return home dragging guilt or obligation behind me like luggage. I returned carrying peace, self-respect, and a quiet strength I never allowed myself to own before. And when I walked up the driveway to my son's house, there was no tremble in my hands, no hesitation in my steps. I wasn't the burdened father they had grown used to. I was a man who had finally remembered himself. David opened the door before I even knocked, his face softening with something between relief and regret the moment he saw me. He hugged me with a desperation that didn't belong to the son who had been pushing me aside for years. It belonged to someone who had finally realized what he had been losing. His arms held on too long, too tight, and for a second I could feel that he was afraid, truly afraid, that if he let go I might slip away again, not physically, but emotionally, spiritually, maybe even permanently. His wife Jess stood behind him with her hands clasped, her eyes glossy with remorse that seemed to spill before she could speak. She apologized before I even stepped inside, her voice trembling as she admitted that she had crossed lines no decent person should cross, that she had allowed her stress and pride to blind her to the humanity of the man standing in front of her. There was sincerity in her voice, but I no longer felt the old instinct to step in, comfort, excuse, or soften. I simply walked past them calmly, not with anger, but with a clarity that felt like iron. When we finally sat in the living room, the same room where I had once shrunk myself to avoid conflict, I didn't sit like a guest, and I didn't sit like a ghost trying not to disturb the air. I sat like a man who belonged to himself now. And for the first time in my life, I spoke to them without bending my voice, without apologizing for existing, without wrapping every truth in softness just to keep the peace. My words were steady, slow, deliberate, the tone of someone who had paid a high price for wisdom and refused to give it away cheaply. I told them plainly that the version of me they were used to was gone, that the days of calling me only when something broke, when money went missing, when their responsibilities threatened to spill over were done. I explained that my finances were mine alone again, that my savings and stability would no longer be a cushion they could secretly rely on, that adulthood came with weight, and they would carry their own from now on. I told them that I would no longer rush to solve their emergencies on demand, no longer be the quiet firefighter in the background saving a home that wasn't mine. And most importantly, I told them that disrespect, even the smallest hint of it, even whispered in frustration, would never again be tolerated in my presence. My son's face crumpled first. His tears weren't loud or dramatic. They were quiet, shaky, the kind that come from realizing you've wounded someone you thought would always forgive you no matter what. Jess cried too, not the defensive tears of someone trying to protect themselves, but the vulnerable tears of someone who finally saw the damage she had helped cause. But as their emotions spilled, mine did not. I didn't raise my voice, didn't soften my boundaries, didn't reach out to comfort them like I once would have. I remained grounded, calm, gentle even, but unwavering, because this wasn't about punishing them and it wasn't about proving a point. This was an awakening, a reclaiming, a rebirth of a man who had spent too many years measuring his worth by how much he could endure. I wasn't trying to hurt them. I was finally choosing to stop hurting myself. And in that living room, with both of them crying and me sitting with a stillness that felt like newfound armor, I realized something powerful. Sometimes the biggest transformation a man can undergo is simply learning to say no with love, enough with dignity, and I matter too without guilt. I didn't return as a broken father seeking forgiveness or validation. I returned as a man who had learned the difference between love and self-sacrifice, between support and servitude, between being needed and being used. And from that moment forward, every breath I took felt like it finally belonged to me. There comes a point in every parent's life when the veil finally lifts, when the decades of sacrifice, compromise, and quiet swallowing of pain reveal a truth that should have been obvious but somehow isn't. Parents are people, not tools designed to fix every broken thing in their children's lives, not walking banks meant to absorb financial disasters, not emotional punching bags built to take hit after hit simply because you're the parent. And yet, somewhere along the line, many children forget this. They grow up believing their parents exist in a kind of unshakable permanence, always available, always forgiving, always ready to give even when there is nothing left to give. But the story you've just heard, my story, is not about blaming my son or dissecting his mistakes. Those are easy conclusions, and life is never that simple. This story is about the pivotal moment in a man's life when he realizes he has been carrying his own worth like an afterthought, shrinking himself to fit the narrow spaces of other people's expectations, and suddenly, mercifully, deciding he will not do that anymore. My cruise was never about escape or indulgence. People called it a vacation, but that word is too small, too flimsy to hold what actually happened. It was a transformation, an unlearning of years spent believing that love required sacrifice to the point of disappearing. On that ship, surrounded by ocean and strangers who somehow saw me more clearly than my own family, I rediscovered parts of myself I had abandoned long ago. I remembered what it felt like to laugh without feeling guilty, to wake up without bracing myself for someone else's needs, to spend money on my own joy without hearing an inner voice whisper that I should save it, just in case the kids need something. I met new people, people who valued my company without expecting anything in return. And for the first time in what felt like an entire lifetime, I realized how small my world had become. How tightly I had folded myself to fit into a life where I was useful but not truly seen. When I came home, the world didn't magically become kinder, but I became different. I started choosing myself in ways that once felt impossible. I took trips just because I wanted to see a sunrise somewhere else. I spent my own money on experiences that made me feel alive instead of pouring it into emergencies that weren't mine to fix. I met people who inspired me, who reminded me that age is not a sentence but a season, one that can still be filled with color and movement and laughter if you allow yourself to step into it. I began living, not the quiet, survival-based existence of a man waiting for his family to need him, but the life of someone who finally understands his worth outside of his usefulness. And the most unexpected thing happened. My son changed too. Not out of fear, not because I demanded it, but because he finally saw me as a person. A real person with dreams, with dignity, with the capacity to walk away from anything that hurt more than it healed. He saw that I could choose myself, that I didn't have to remain in the shadows of his busy life, and something in him shifted. Respect bloomed where assumption once lived. Gratitude replaced entitlement. For the first time in years, he saw me not as a resource or a safety net, but as a man with a life of his own, a life I was finally willing to protect. So if you're reading this and you feel like a burden, if you've been bending and breaking yourself just to stay in spaces where you are barely appreciated, remember this truth that took me far too long to learn. The day you choose yourself is the day the world recalibrates around you. The day you say, "I matter too," is the day others begin to treat you like you do. And sometimes, the most powerful message you will ever send, louder than shouting, clearer than pleading, is the act of quietly walking away, not out of spite, but out of love for the person you are still becoming. Because when you stop being a burden to yourself, you stop allowing others to turn you into one. And that, more than anything, is the beginning of real freedom.